Hey everyone, my name is Jeff Young. Thanks for watching. You may have heard recently about the prediction of an invasion of spiders on the East Coast this summer. Seriously? An invasive species of spider, the size of a child's hand, is expected to colonize the entire East Coast this spring by parachuting down from the sky, researchers at the University of Georgia announced last week. I mean, large Joro spiders, the report continues, millions of them, are expected to begin ballooning up and down the East Coast as early as May. Researchers have determined that the spiders are harmless to humans, as their fangs are too small to break human skin. One can only hope. One person on Twitter commented, "So we've reached that part of the TV series where the screenwriters are just typing whatever comes to mind as they power through all-night benders. We've had a pandemic, an attempted coup, and a war. But we need something new for season 4. I've got it! Giant spiders raining down from the sky. Brilliant. Let's go with that." All joking aside, the tragic war in Ukraine has been deeply disturbing. 44 million people will wind up either radically displaced, many without their husbands or fathers. Thousands have been and will be murdered, maimed, executed, residences and cities obliterated. But among other things, this once again raises the issue of evil and human suffering and a good God. We will begin to discuss that next. Evil and human suffering is a problem for everyone, particularly those who believe in a benevolent God. The problem of evil has been around for as long as human consciousness has. In the Bible, the ancient book of Job wrestles with this very issue, and many other parts do so as well. Ecclesiastes, the Psalms, and the prophets. In this video, I want to briefly introduce our subject, along with some particular thinkers and scholars who have helped me wrestle with this, and delve more deeply into the issue in follow-up videos. I hope you'll be able to join in these and to give careful and attentive consideration to the ideas I'll be sharing. Numerous people, from the average person on the street to philosophers and theologians, have given up faith in God, at least the God of the Bible, in large part because of the problem of evil and suffering in the world. To be sure, that's not the only reason, but it is probably the foremost reason intellectuals give for rejecting God, and I think just a lot of average people. Nobel Prize winning scientist Sir Frederick Hoyle, in a lecture from 40 years ago entitled Evolution from Space, expresses the problem in its classical form, which really goes back at least as far as Augustine. If God is both all-powerful and all-good, why is there so much acute suffering in the world? I've not myself come on any discussion of this paradox that seems satisfactory, and I am surely not alone in arguing that, since theologians in 1500 years have not been able to offer more than apologies of an answer to it, there must be something wrong in their position. The trouble is clear from the present picture. The creator of carbonaceous life was not all-powerful, and consequently there is no paradox. The creator of carbonaceous life was motivated by a harsh necessity, out of which the present situation may well be as optimal as could be managed. It's important to understand that in Hoyle's mind, the creator of life, he believes life on Earth was created, but not by an omnipotent God outside of the universe, but by some other intelligence that emerged from within the universe. Hoyle writes elsewhere, "The God of Judeo-Christian theology is outside the universe and is said to be superior to it, whereas the intelligence responsible for the creation of carbonaceous life in the present picture is within the universe and is subservient to it." Nevertheless, Hoyle's argument there is really restating the classical argument that has been around for centuries. The so-called new atheists, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, may he rest in peace, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, have each made this argument in one form or another. Popular Bible scholar Bart Ehrman, another antagonist of the Christian faith, has essentially Xeroxed the age-old argument that Hoyle had expressed earlier. In his book, God's Problem, Ehrman states the case at the start. If there is an all-powerful and loving God in this world, why is there so much excruciating pain and unspeakable suffering? The problem of suffering has haunted me for a long time, he writes. He's far from the first, of course. It was what made me begin to think about religion when I was young. It is what led me to question my faith when I was older. Ultimately, it was the reason I lost my faith. In his book, Misquoting Jesus, Ehrman writes, "For many people who inhabit this planet, life is a cesspool of misery and suffering." Indeed, tragically it is. I came to a point where I simply could not believe that there is a good and kindly disposed ruler who is in charge of it. That final phrase, ruler who is in charge of it, reflects one of the fissures in Ehrman's argument, in my view. Not the only one, of course. I hope to address that ever so briefly here in a few minutes and in more detail in future discussions. But his cynicism toward the existence of God and of the Bible is grounded in this issue. So, what can we say about evil and suffering in the world, including human, animal, and creational suffering, and the alleged presence of a good and loving Creator God? A central question is, why is the world the way it is? First, let me say, I don't know that there is any sort of simple, concrete, or clear answer to the why of the problem of evil and suffering. But I do think that there are legitimate insights that provide an inkling into the why of the problem, and that there are reasons for both faith in God and hope for ultimate good for all sufferers, even if the answers are not fully evident in this present world. There are several different approaches to the problem and useful books, both philosophical and theological. In this series, I hope to share various ideas from just a few of these. Among those are David Bentley Hart, The Doors of the Sea, Where Was God in the Tsunami? John Polkinghorne, Science and Providence, Marilyn McCord Adams, Christ and Horrors, Michael C. Ray, The Hiddenness of God. I feel like I'm reading off a list of Academy Award documentary nominees here. Scott Harrower, God of All Comfort, a Trinitarian response to the horrors of this world. Ethics and the Problem of Evil, edited by James P. Sturba, with multiple scholars in ethics and morality contributing. John D. Levinson, the great Harvard scholar, perhaps the preeminent Hebrew Bible or Old Testament scholar in the U.S., Creation and the Persistence of Evil. Levinson's book, by the way, is not really an answer or an attempt to answer the problem, but an intriguing and fascinating discussion of how people in the Old Testament responded to God in light of evil. We'll touch upon that in just a moment. So we had a microphone glitch. Don't know what happened. Watching the replay of my video, trying to edit a little bit, and sound went out. So I'm starting over about where I left off. There are three aspects that I think are essential to any consideration and response to the problem of evil. The first is compassionate love. We've got to recognize there are horrendous evils. Too often we go to a quick answer and we don't really recognize the degree of suffering that people are going through at the time. And even if you have suffered tremendously, there may be somebody else who has suffered even worse and suffers the horrors of a lifetime of evil. We'll talk about some of that. The second element is just working through all the issues, trying to reason our way to seek to understand how is it possible the world is the way it is, dealing with some hard questions through all of that. And thirdly, from a Christian standpoint or believer standpoint, is the idea of hope, which is connected to 1 and 2, but also a separate point on its own. These are all interwoven together. Any answer has to be encompassing of multiple areas. And let me add, I don't think that this hope is one that precludes sorrowful or even at times angry lamentation to God, nor do I think it just simply solves all the issues. And I think prayer is significant, or simply complaining. In his book, Creation and the Persistence of Evil, John Levinson writes, The overwhelming tendency of biblical writers as they confront undeserved evil is not to explain it away, but to call upon God to blast it away. This struck me, Levinson writes, as a significant difference between biblical and philosophical thinking that had not been given its due, either by theologians in general or by biblical theologians in particular. No biblical text comes closer to this classical formulation of the problem of evil than Jeremiah 12. You will be in the right, O Lord, if I make a claim against you, yet I shall present my charges against you. Why does the way of the wicked prosper? Why are the workers of treachery at ease? You have planted them. They have taken root. They spread. They even bear fruit. You are present in their mouths, but far from their thoughts. Yet you, Lord, have noted and observed me. You have tested my heart and found it with you. Drive them out like sheep to the slaughter. Prepare them for the day of slaying. Levinson continues to comment, the question is familiar. Why does the way of the wicked prosper? The answer, however, and please note, there is an answer here, is nothing like the rationalizations proposed by the philosophers. Drive them out like sheep to the slaughter. The answer to the question of the suffering of the innocent is a renewal of activity on the part of the God of justice. In light of the answer, it becomes clear that the question is not an intellectual exercise, but rather a taunt intended to goad the just God into action after a long quiescence. What provokes that troubling exhortation is the awareness that history, no less than nature, slips out of God's control and into the hands of obscure but potent forces of malignancy that oppose everything he is reputed to uphold. In another place, Levinson writes, the worshiping community does not burst into song because they have suddenly recalled the uniform, uninterrupted truth that, quote, God is in control. Recall here Ehrman's observation, I simply could not believe that there is a good and kindly ruler who is in charge of it. Rather, Levinson continues, their excitement is owing to the perception that he is at last about to redeem them as befits his faithfulness. The possibility of an interruption in his faithfulness is indeed troubling, and I repeat that I have ventured no explanation for it. I might add that I find it especially odd that scholars who lived through the years of the Holocaust and other unspeakable horrors of our century, he's writing in the 20th century, hasn't even approached this century yet, should have imagined that the Hebrew Bible consistently upheld a doctrine of God's uniform, uninterrupted kingship, in spite of ample textual evidence to the contrary. This calls into question the presumption that many, including Ehrman, make, and I believe many Christians make. The, quote, God is in control theology, or good and kindly ruler who is in charge of it. That is not a theology present in the Bible, from my understanding. I'll have more to say on that later. I think Levinson, though, raises a significant point, not least because many Christians are quick to respond to suffering or evil with, don't worry, God is in control. God has this. God is doing this for a reason. Which begs the question, why is God letting such horrors happen? And you can say, well, God's doing this for a reason, but there are some horrors that happen to people for which there is no real rational reason or benefit. In fact, I think that commonplace sentiment, God is in control, actually does more harm to faith than help it. Causes more problems than it solves. And I think we should really think about how we work through that. The first part of the compassion and love point, which ties into 2 and 3, is feeling the full weight of evil in the world. An important point that I want to highlight throughout this study, and will emphasize in several different discussions, is that glib, quick-fix answers from Christians, or, quote, follow God and you will have the ability to experience His love, leave a bad taste in the mouth of many people in light of the horrendous evils that many in this world suffer, and we just don't give enough weight to that. So much of modern Christian, especially evangelical theology, fails to address this well because it sees God and the Bible generally through the lens of positive experiences, quite often of middle-class, predominantly white America, or of experiences of rescuing us from some terrible situation that puts us in a wonderful setting in the here and now. So God is seen as a benevolent, loving God, and if we just follow Him, God will work great things in our life, even if there are a few painful moments and evils to deal with here and there. And I also think that's a much more shallow reading of the Bible and doesn't take into account the full impact of all of the scriptures and some problematic texts as well. It fails to see that a positive life experience is often driving how we read the Bible and develop our theology, rather than feeling the full reality of life on earth. It is a theology grounded in optimism and sugar-coatedness. The Bible is not about optimism. It's about hope in a world full of hopelessness. In hope against hope, Abraham believed. One of the real challenges in speaking about any subject like this is that Christians want something different than non-Christians or people who are wrestling with the problems of evil and other issues in the Bible. Christians tend to live in a bubble where we want Bible-proof text and nice stories that feed our hunger for seeing God as this loving, wonderful being without problems or difficulties for the human world and human thinking. And we want a nice 3-point solution in a sermon or two. And there are other problematic assumptions that I hope to address later. Hey everyone, jumping in here with a few thoughts I left out in my first presentation. We talked about compassion as an important aspect of responding to evil and suffering, but Christian views of prayer also present problems for answering the problem of evil. How does God answer prayer? Is prayer a magic elixir of some sort? Does God snap God's fingers and change things? I think a lot of Christians see it that way. Then some say, well, it's just God's will when prayer doesn't get answered. But that creates even more problems. Does God specifically stop horrendous evil sometimes for some people, and not at other times for other people? Evils that we might describe as meaningful life destroying? If God does miraculous things through prayer, then God should be able to at least curb horrendous evils, right? Like genocide of millions, or race-based slavery of millions, or the destruction of Ukraine that's going on right now before our eyes. Yet, those issues seem often to be left to humans to solve. And I'm not saying that prayer has no bearing, but there are problems there. Another book that seeks to answer this is God Can't by Thomas J. Oord, which sees God as self-restricted by, ironically, love. I hope to discuss portions of that at some point in the near future. Scott Harrower writes, horrors raise theological, existential, and pastoral questions. How is God involved in a world pockmarked by horrors? Is it possible to live meaningfully in such a random and death-directed world? Is there any hope for recovery from horrors and the traumas that they generate in us? Simplistic answers to the question raised by horrors do more harm than good. Yet, engaging with these questions and the nature of horrors is something that maturing Christians must face, lest our questions become roadblocks to faith. Marilyn McCord Adams, who has written more prolifically on the problem of horrendous evils in the world than probably any other author, she was a Christian philosopher. She wrote, "The deepest issue raised by participation in the worst evils is not whether God has violated our rights, but whether God is for us, whether God can be trusted to be good to us, whether God, after all, hates us, whether God has abandoned us or simply doesn't care." Indeed, horrendous evils are prima facie life-ruinous. Examples that she raises include parental incest. There's a story she tells of a woman who was raped and had her arms severed. Adams writes, "We should not quit wrestling with the problems of evil until we have explanations of how God can be good to those who participate in the worst evils, of how God can still be trusted to be for them, even though the worst has already happened, of how reconciliation and intimacy with God can be reasonable for them. We must feel the full weight of evil before we seek to address evil." I also find that non-belief in God to offer a far less degree of explanatory power and to offer zero hope in the face of horrendous evils. And even being problematic in naming something as evil, but that's a different subject. An observation I will return to in the future, Lord willing, comes from the hand of a Holocaust survivor and Nobel Prize winning author Elie Wiesel, who wrote about a conversation with one of his rabbi teachers years after the Holocaust. "Rabbi, how can you believe in God after Auschwitz?" The rabbi's response, "How can you not believe in God after Auschwitz?" We are so quick to doubt our beliefs. Are we willing to doubt our doubts? A couple of observations from David Bentley Hart and a brief note from John Polkinghorne, and we will stop here. In his book, The Doors of the Sea, I highly recommend this book if you're wrestling with the problem of evil, Hart writes, "If we are honest in asking what God this is that all our skeptics so despise, we must ultimately conclude, while he is not the God announced by the Christian gospel, he is nevertheless a kind of faint and distorted echo of that announcement. The atheist who argues from worldly suffering, even crudely, against belief in a God both benevolent and omnipotent is still someone whose moral expectations of God and moral disappointments have been shaped at the deepest level by the language of Christian faith. The actual arguments employed may not demonstrate a keen understanding of the Christian tradition, and they may fail strictly in terms of their logic, but they are not directed merely at a phantom without any substance whatsoever. Behind the mask of this God, in whom no one really believes, is at the very least a memory of the God whom Christians proclaim, or a shadow of a memory. For this reason," writes Hart, "the atheist who cannot believe for moral reasons does honor in an elliptical way to the Christian God, and so must not be ignored. He, the atheist, demands of us not the surrender of our beliefs, but a meticulous recollection on our part of what those beliefs are, and a definition of divine love that has at least the moral rigor of principled unbelief. This, it turns out, is no simple thing. For sometimes, atheism seems to retain elements of Christianity within itself that Christians have all too frequently forgotten." Indeed. In closing, John Polkinghorne speaks to the problem of evil in his book Science and Providence, and I think provides a very good introductory and summary response. I won't go into great detail here, but want to consider his discussion in the next video. Polkinghorne expresses the same sentiment that Harrower, Hart, Adams, and others we've already heard from do. Many perspectives by Christians on the problem of evil fail fully to grapple with the agonizing intensity of the problem, presented by the degree of suffering encountered in a world which is held to be the creation of a good and powerful God. Indeed. I hope you'll continue with us in this series in the near future as we seek to jump into more detail with respect to the problem of evil and suffering. YouTubers always ask people to click on the subscribe button or ring the bell that you see below. If you want to, that would be great. And also, feel free to offer comments or questions. I only ask that you be respectful. I want to close with the reading of a lament on behalf of all sufferers, but especially at this moment, those suffering tragically in the Ukraine. Psalm 44, "Rouse yourself. Why do you sleep, O Lord? Awake. Do not cast us off forever. Why do you hide your face? Why do you forget our affliction and oppression? We sink down to the dust. Our bodies cling to the ground. Rise up. Come to our help. Redeem us for the sake of your steadfast love." Thanks for watching. Love and peace to you all. Thank you.